Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
Well, Tony, this is going to be a really fun show because we had a listener question a couple weeks ago that was like, that shouldn't be a 5-minute conversation on a listener question show. That should be its whole show itself. And then we talked about it and we're like, it should be 2 shows itself. Maybe even more than 2 shows itself. So this was a great one. Isaac McIntyre asked us to put together our all 1990s Ohio State team, our all 2000s Ohio State team, our all 2010s Ohio State team. And then if you combine those 3 teams into like one big Voltron of 1990 through 2019 Ohio State football, what would that team look like? Tony, I'm always willing to talk a little 1990s Ohio State football, so this one is right in my wheelhouse, as I'm sure it is for you as well.
Oh, yeah. And it was fun to go through and pick all of the teams, and the amount of names that get left off, because this is just 11 offensive players, 11 defensive players. Now, I did go the extra mile and put the special teamers on there, kickers, punters, punt returner, and kick returner. I can even go long snapper, though I did not do that, and I apologize to the long snappers out there. Did you go special teams as well, Tom?
Of course I did. I put punt gunners on there, too. Did you not? I thought you respected the audience, Tony. No, I did not. I did not do punt gunners, but I did do kicker, punter, kick return, punt return, yes.
I should also say, we didn't discuss this beforehand, but the 90s and the 2000s, I have a fullback. The 2010s, I have a third receiver.
Yeah, I did a fullback for the 90s, and I did 2 tailbacks for the 2000s, and then I went to 3 receivers for the 2010s.
I feel like that's cheating, but we'll get to that show when we get to that show. Today, we were talking about the best decade of all time, the 1990s, and it was the glory years of Ohio State football. John Cooper brought the Buckeyes back from the brink of Earl Brewston and returned the Buckeyes to the glory of America's team. If I think that's what we called them back then.
It was a good decade for America's team, although unlike the other America's team, Ohio State has continued to play football into the current century, unlike others in the DFW Metroplex.
Now, so let's begin. Let's start this because, again, my lineup is just it's 11 guys. It's not like the Pro Bowl where it's like a quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 receivers. Like I've got 11 guys on offense, 11 guys on defense. And the quarterback situation, I think there's an argument for 2 guys, basically, Joe Germain and Bobby Hoying. And I think Bobby Hoying was a 2-year starter, but he was bailed out a lot in 94, or actually he was almost a 3-year starter, wasn't he? Because Brett Powers bailed him out in 93, then he was okay in 94, then he was really good in 95. Sorry. And of course, Joe Germain was only a 1-year starter in 98, but he was the guy in 96 and 97 to come off the bench with Stan Jackson. Given the win over Michigan in 98, the win in the Rose Bowl, I went with Joe Germain, even though Bobby Hoying has a win over Michigan in 94. I went with Joe Germain.
I did as well. I think, those are 2 quarterbacks who at the time were putting up just unthinkable passing numbers for Ohio State, which now you look at it and it's like, wow, they passed that at Halloween again this year. But, at the time it was, Walt Harris coming in the mid 90s and, Bobby Hoying, that 95 season was where it really felt like 93. They had a good year. They went 10-1-1 and shared the Big Ten championship, and it was like, okay, Cooper has them going in the right direction. 95 was the first year that they looked like a real juggernaut for most of the season. And through 11 games, that was a team that just dominated everyone they played and put up just explosive offensive numbers. But yeah, overall, I think that 98 team, when in doubt, you kind of go with the guys who had the biggest seasons and the best seasons on the biggest stages, and that was Joe Germain won the Rose Bowl with that big come from behind against Arizona State. Joe Germain won the Sugar Bowl with the big win over Texas A&M. He beat Michigan in 98. So yeah, I went with Joe Germain. The only other person I really considered there was Michael Wiley, but I felt like he probably did not hit the minimum passing numbers to qualify for the team.
That's a great point, Tom. certainly had the completion percentage, Tate Martellian, if you will, that outstanding, the best throwing running back in Ohio State football history. So let's move to running back, and there's one Heisman Trophy winner among the group. I do have a very special place in my heart for Raymont Harris. I did also have Michael Wiley listed here because he is one of the top running backs of the 90s for the Buckeyes. Robert Smith, of course, began his career in the 90s. But the answer here is Eddie George. 1,927 yards rushing in 1995, 1,400 yards the year before. 95, he rushed for 100 yards in every single game except for the season opener against Boston College, where he was held to 97 in a comfortable
99.
win. 99,
yes.
Yeah, and obviously could have had it then, but this is the only answer here, Eddie George.
Yeah, this is one of those things where I think when you're starting to fill this stuff out, you first fill in the Heisman Trophy winners and go, okay, if you were the best player in college football in this year, then okay, you get it. And Ohio State has only had 3 players who qualified for that over this span: Eddie George, Troy Smith, and Orlando Pace. Because I don't recognize the foolishness of the Heisman voters in 1995. So you put those 3 in, and then you kind of start going through the All Americans and fill some of those guys in, and then you kind of go from there. But yeah, this was an easy one to me. Ohio State had plenty of great running backs in the 1990s, but they only had one Heisman Trophy winner. Eddie George had the record for most yards in a season for a long time. That was, a dominating season, ended up having a great pro career. That was a pretty easy one for me.
Now comes a very difficult one, Tom, fullback. And this is where, Raymont Harris started his career at fullback. Nicky Sualua, Jeff Cothran. Scotty Graham is still one of my all-time favorites. He's early 90s, running the ball, him and Carlos Snow. Matt Keller in the mid to late 90s. But there is just this, there's a legend around Nicky Sualua. And I don't know if I'm choosing him because of that legend or because he was that legend. Like, has the legend grown since he played, or was this an accurate, are we giving him an accurate portrayal of what he was as a fullback?
I think that's a little bit of a legend grows, because he was the first name I thought of, but then I had him for a minute, and then I thought, no, Matt Keller out of the backfield catching all those passes like that, he was so good. And I ended up settling on Jeff Cothran. I think I think there's a viable defense for just about any of them. I think the only name we have, Scotty Graham was dominant as well. I think there's be a good argument for him. I think the only 90s fullback we haven't mentioned here is Matt Calhoun. So there we go. And now we've completed the set. But yeah, I ended up going with Jeff Cothran, but I think you could make a very compelling case for any of about 3 or 4 guys, and I'm not really going to fight you on it.
Yeah, it just depends. Do you want your fullback to run the ball, or do you just want him to block? If you're going to use him in the offense, then Jeff Cothran would be a fantastic fullback. I think Scotty Graham rushed for about 935 yards one year when he was a fullback and a tailback. But I think you can't go wrong with any of those guys. Now, let's move to receiver, because we can just do this bang bang, because there are 2 answers here, and if you'd like to share them with the class.
Terry Glenn and David Boston. Next question, please.
Because the 2 best single season performances for wide receivers maybe ever. I'm just trying to think of recently what's been done. Obviously, Jackson Smith and Jigba, but like back then, Terry Glenn was amazing in 95. Missed a couple of games in there. David Boston was the best receiver in college football, I think, as a sophomore and a junior, and was a dominating guy. So those 2 guys, that's the simplest thing, I think, and maybe a top 5 simple answer in this entire exercise.
And I think if you went with 3 wide receivers on this team, there's a pretty simple answer for the third one as well. In my opinion, we're going to get to him in the kick returning, punt returning section of this exercise. But I think those 2 guys are clearly head and shoulders above some of the others. What's interesting to me is you have a couple guys there who are clearly head and shoulders for the whole decade of the 1990s. I think you could make a very compelling case that there are 4 guys from the 2020s who would be, at least kind of in the conversation with those 2 guys. right now already, and we've only seen 3 seasons of the 2020s. So I think that's a good indication exactly how far above the historical norm Ohio State is at wide receiver right now.
Yeah. Moving to tight end, again, I think this is a pretty easy one. I didn't really look past Ricky Dudley because it's a standard bearer that always stands out. 1995, the offense was amazing. Ricky Dudley, 30 some odd catches. And it seems like so much more back then, but he was a viable weapon. It's just they were also throwing the ball like 47 times to Eddie George. So like there are only so many passes to go around, and they didn't throw it all over the place. They still ran the ball pretty much 65% of the time, I'd say 60% of the time. But Ricky Dudley, I don't know who else is. John Lumpkin. Honestly, I could not even mention too many others. DJ Jones. There's just kind of no point, no offense. Darnell Sanders in maybe like 99 or something like that. But this is Ricky Dudley.
Yeah, I mean, if you are a top 10 NFL draft pick out of the tight end position and there's not a real obvious All-American anywhere else on the list, then yeah, that makes it a real easy pick. And he was the one that immediately jumped to mind. And then you can build a case around stats. You can build a case around NFL draft spot. You can build a case around whatever you want. And I think you kind of end up in the same place. And yeah, that was definitely Ricky Dudley.
So now, again, we can just go ahead and knock 2 out here. Let's go with the tackles. And the way I did it, I did go left tackle, left guard, center, right guard. I didn't just go like 2 tackles, 2 guards. I'm talking, we're playing your position. If I'm going to call on you to play my right tackle, you can't have been a left tackle. I need you to be a right tackle. And so it's Orlando Pace and it's Corey Stringer. And honestly, put them on every other team as well. And just go from there and you're going to be fine. Orlando Pace, the best Ohio State football player of all time, the best player in college football history. Corey Stringer, maybe arguably the second best offensive tackle in Ohio State history. There are obviously some other, John Hicks and things like that, but a top 5 tackle in Ohio State history, I think. And so you put those 2 together and boom, you're set.
Yep, that was a real easy one as well. That was, Orlando Pace was the absolute free space on the bingo card, and Corey Stringer was, again, a just incredibly talented. He probably gets a little overshadowed because he shared the field with Orlando Pace during his final season, and then Orlando Pace then exceeded everything he did immediately. Where he's a little bit you kind of don't appreciate him because he wasn't the greatest at that position for that long of a period. He's not remembered as the greatest at tackle because he was immediately succeeded by Orlando Pace, but. Yeah, I think those 2 guys are both very, very easy choices at the 2 tackle spots.
Then the last easy answer here for me, left guard, is Rob Murphy, All-American, maybe 2-time All-American. And so I feel like that one is pretty set. Center and right guard, Tom, center, I think you've got 2 answers here because you got 2 3-year starters.
Well, I went with...
Or did you go to the 99?
I went with... No, I didn't go 1999, and I thought about it, but, that was... 1999 would have been LaCharles Bentley, but he wasn't necessarily quite as dominant that year as he was, in 2000. So I ended up going with Dan Beatty. He was all-conference in 1990, but that's honestly before I really started watching Ohio State football. So I kind of defaulted to, well, here's what the awards voters said. So, okay, I will trust your judgment there. But I mean, there are other viable options there, but there is definitely not a clear cut answer there the way there was at the first 3 spots.
No, and I'm just looking at the OSU starters by year, and at 99 they actually have LaCharles Bentley at guard and Kurt Murphy his third year at center. And so you had Juan Porter as a 3-year starter, Kurt Murphy as a 3-year starter. This was not an easy one, and whoever you want to take, I'm not going to pound the table for anybody. I thought Juan Porter was very, very solid though in the mid 90s with Orlando Pace and Corey Stringer. So that's where I went. Right guard again. Ben Gilbert and LaShawn Daniels is basically the 2 guys that I'm trying to choose from, and
I had Jason Winrow in the mix as well. And I couldn't swear to you that he played right guard instead of left guard. I think he did, but he's someone who got drafted by the Giants and was a solid player, but not All-American or anything like that. So I would be fine with any of those choices. Maybe LaShawn Daniels, maybe, but I'm not going to kick and scream if you pick one of the other ones.
Well, and Tom, I just got to break this to you. In 1993, it's listed Jason Winrow as a left guard. So,
all right. Well, then I'm going to go with LaShawn Daniels then.
So now we move to defense, where I went, and this is how I've done it in the 90s. I went for two defensive ends, 2 defensive tackles, 3 linebackers, 2 corners, and 2 safeties. I have not moved into any hybridization at this point, but we can go ahead. My defensive ends, and I just went with the defensive ends I went to college with, Mike Vrabel and Matt Finkus. And you're leaving some pretty good names on the table when you just go with those 2, which I have. Like Jason Simmons was at one point the all-time sacks leader before Mike Vrabel. Alonzo Spellman, Rodney Bailey is below those guys, but and then what could have been with Jason Gwynn, something like that. But I went with Vrabel and Finkus.
I went with Vrabel and Jason Simmons just because Simmons was, as you said, the all-time sack leader, and he's still very, very high on a lot of those lists. If you look at the OSU record book, he's another guy who was just like a little before I started really paying attention to Ohio State football. So that was not someone I have a memory of, but if you go through the record book, it's like, well, this guy was obviously extremely good at what he did. So, I think there's a perfectly viable argument to make Finkus the other guy, but I think you got to kind of, if you were the guy who was setting all the records when you were playing, I think you're probably got to be, got to be in that conversation. So yeah, Vrabel and Simmons were the defensive ends for me.
Yeah, I have no problem with that at all because like Mike Vrabel was the new Jason Simmons basically. So then defensive tackle, this is very easy with Big Daddy. And I didn't go, maybe I did, nose tackle, 3 tackle. I just went 2 defensive tackles. So you throw Dan Wilkinson in there. My other guy is Ryan Pickett.
I did the same thing.
Okay. He was, I don't want to say the poor man's Big Daddy, but he had moments where he was a dominating player, very quick guy for being such a big guy. And I knew Luke Fickell was a 4-year starter at nose tackle. I argue that Greg Smith, earlier than just a couple years before, Luke Fickell was maybe more disruptive than Fickell. Fickell, I don't think was ever an all Big Ten player. Greg Smith, I think was, but to me, this is Dan Wilkinson and Ryan Pickett.
And I did the same thing. And Pickett had 9 tackles for loss in 1999. So yeah, it felt like that was enough of a defensible choice because he ended up getting drafted in the 2001 NFL draft because he had another year after that, but really had a really, really good year on a very, very forgettable 1999 Ohio State team and was a first-round pick for the Rams. And, I think he's someone who you could certainly make an argument for Fickell just based on career longevity, just because of he was a very, very good player for a very long time for Ohio State, but was not an All-American, was not a first-round draft pick, anything like that. So I'm not gonna fight you if you want to put Luke Fickell on that team, but I'm going with I'm with you. I went with Ryan Pickett, and I thought that was going to be one where you went, oh, really? But no, apparently it is the safe conservative choice.
Yes, no, Tom, it's bold. if we both agree on it, we can make it bold.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, 3 points, Ryan Pickett.
The linebackers here, and spanning the decade of the 90s, there aren't a lot, but there's more than 3. But is there a big 3? I don't know. I think there's a big 2, and I'll give you my first one because he was 3-time All Big Ten and a 2-time All American, and that's Steve Tovar. And big number 58 was a very, very good player for the Buckeyes. I think he got to Ohio State when Ohio State was still playing like a 3-4, and then became a 4-3 middle linebacker. But that was my first guy. I know a lot of other people are going to chime in with a 1996 freshman here. And Tom, if you would like to go ahead, but I went with Steve Tovar as my first linebacker just because of the accolades.
Yeah, and Steve, you're a multi-time All-American. You're probably going to be on this team. So yes, I had him on there as well. 1996 freshman, yes. Michael Wiley, yes. No, it's Andy Katzenmoyer. This was another easy one for me. I think if you just ask the random Ohio State fan on the street who was the best Ohio State linebacker in the 1990s, they're going to say Andy Katzenmoyer. And he was a combination of production, but also hype, but also backed it up on the field. He came to Ohio State in 96 as a true freshman. They put him at middle linebacker. And, Greg Belisari, I think at times was just basically like pointing him and just saying, go hit that guy. And he did. And he didn't have time to really get up to speed on everything before they threw him out there, but he was still extremely effective as a true freshman in that role. And then just kind of continued to be a dominant player after that. I think everyone remembers the Corby Jones hit from the Missouri game and all that, but he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated when the question was he going to be, was he going to be able to pass all his classes to play the games? Because he was such a big part of what was that dominant 1998 Ohio State team. So, yeah, he is I think he's an easy inclusion here as well. The third one, Tony, for me at least, was someone who only ended up at Ohio State because someone else couldn't send a fax correctly. How about you?
That is my third as well. I just want to get back to Andy Katzenmoyer for 1 second. Just go over some freshman numbers, okay? 5 tackles for loss in the Rose Bowl, 3 sacks in that game. His freshman year, he finished with 12 sacks, which is still tied for 5th all time. He had 23 tackles for loss in 1996 as a true freshman. I don't even know how many tackles he had that year, but I think it was around 90 or so. But that's just, it was incredible. And if you're too young to have witnessed any of that, he was overnight a superstar. I think he was the first Buckeye I remember people talking about. He would be the number 1 draft pick this year. And then, he was eventually a first rounder, but some neck injuries, and he just kept getting bigger and bigger as a sophomore and junior. But that freshman year, there was, it was just incredible. So yes, my third linebacker, Tom, like you, Niall Diggs, and I feel like he got overshadowed by LeVar Arrington, who was around the same time making incredible plays. Niall Diggs would also make some great plays. I think Niall Diggs was a first-team All-American, at least once. I do want to give a shout-out to Lorenzo Styles, Craig Powell, other guys, but the 3 here, I think those 3 are pretty set. And Niall Diggs was, he played some defensive end early in his career. Like, he could have played anywhere on the defensive, end, any of the linebacker positions. He was a really, really talented athlete.
Yeah, he was someone who, like you said, I think the fact that he was, towards the end of his career, that was some of those, like the 1990, I think, wasn't 1999 one of his last seasons? I believe it was. And, like 1999. And those teams just sort of get forgotten because you remember the 96 team, you remember the 95 team, you remember the 98 team. You might, the 97 team is kind of in that conversation as well. But, 99, 2000, those teams just kind of get forgotten because they didn't do anything memorable. They didn't, pull the shocking win over Michigan like the 2001 team did or the 94 team did. They didn't win the Big Ten. They didn't, and the standard had risen enough at that point that those were like grossly unacceptable seasons to Ohio State fans, and people probably kind of pulled the ripcord halfway through the season. But yeah, there were some really outstanding individual performances on those teams, and I'd put Niall Diggs right at the top of those lists because I think I know he got picked by the Packers. Was he a first round pick? I think he ended up being like a second or third rounder actually. And then he stuck with them for a little while. Yeah. And then, like you mentioned Craig Powell. Craig Powell, I think, was a first round pick for the Browns. There were some really talented linebackers on those teams. But yeah, I went with Niall Diggs ahead of the other guys. And maybe the best of all would have been Rodell Dupree, but he just couldn't stay in school. Well, and Preston Harrison too. Preston Harrison was recruited as a quarterback. They moved him to defense, and he was someone who he got picked by the Chargers like shockingly early, second, third round, something like that, just based on just the absolute freak athleticism, but just couldn't stay healthy. He had just like a series of injuries that kept him off the field. And, he's another one of those great what ifs for Ohio State. Now, if they were going to play some hybrid
I might go with the name here that might just be a little before your time, Tom. Roger Harper, who big 6'3", 220 pound, 225 pound safety, who would be like a star type of position. But let's move to corner now, because there are a lot of corners, but I think there are two correct answers here. Arguably the two greatest cornerbacks in Ohio State football history, Tom. They are
Sean Springs and Antoine Winfield. And I know Antoine Winfield is a personal favorite for you. Sean Springs was the 3rd overall pick to the Seahawks in the 97 draft. I mean, those are two players who were just, you could list a bunch of really good corners at Ohio State over that decade, but there were two that these were two of the ones that I filled in first, because it was like, well, you're not going to beat these two, so if you want to time travel and put a nickel out there or something, that's fine. We could add someone else out there, but yeah, those were two very easy ones to me.
Well, and you say nickel, like Nate Clements started his career as a nickel. So did Antoine Winfield.
Mm-hmm.
They were nickels. Nate Clements, a first rounder. Ahmed Plummer, a first rounder. Ty Howard, a second rounder. The starter next to Antoine Winfield when those guys were playing. So there's some other good guys there. Safety is interesting. I think for me, Damon Moore that's the first answer.
Yeah, he's the strong safety. Yep.
Yes, and he was. I believe he was an All-American at least one year, and was a playmaker and intercepted passes and tackled, was a big hitter. Tom, who is your second safety?
I tried to split this into strong and free safety, and I had two names down, and I don't feel particularly strongly about either one.
Can I guess them?
Sure.
Gary Berry and Rob Kelly?
I had Gary Berry and Walter Taylor. Walter Taylor was someone who, and he's again, like earlier, so I kind of am reading up on Walter Taylor, and he sounded impressive. But, Rob Kelly is one of the first people I think of, Newark Catholic star, Rob Kelly, who ended up, was a real big hitter, and has had some health issues, I think, as a result that have been reported as a result of being a big hitter. But yeah, he I think was someone who a lot of people will probably think of there. But yeah, this is one where I think I would accept any of those three answers and not really give you any grief about it.
Yeah, I also had Chico Nelson, who was a 3-year starter, but more of a strong safety kind of guy, I think is what he played. Roger Harper again, but also a big guy. So if you want to throw Gary Berry out there, he was a 3-year starter, never quite lived up to the 5-star hype, but was still pretty solid. Kicker and punter, Tom, I went with Dan Stoltz and Brent Bartholomew. Brent Bartholomew is the all-time punting yardage leader at Ohio State. Dan Stoltz was, maybe you would just disagree, but I think he was the most productive and the best of the 90s kickers, and I don't know that it was a great decade for Ohio State kickers, but he was productive.
Yeah, I went with Tim Williams and Brent Bartholomew. Tim Williams, like the first year I really followed Ohio State football was 1993, and I just remember Tim Williams just feeling just automatic when he was out there. Stoltz, Stoltz, I think missed. Maybe this is just my memory being unfair to him, but I don't remember feeling as confident in him as I did in Tim Williams when he was out there. But multi-year starter, very good kicker. I think that's the thing I remember most about Dan Stoltz is his extremely enthusiastic celebrations after kicks, which I think would go over great in the Twitter era. But yeah, he was someone who, like, he was a little bit of a character, but yeah, he was a very, very solid kicker as well.
I do also remember somebody from that special teams unit saying he was a head case, but it's like, isn't that all kickers? Kick return, punt return. I went with Joey Galloway as my kickoff returner because he's got to be somewhere on this team of the 90s. I went with David Boston as my punt returner. Is he still the all-time punt return and yardage leader at Ohio State? I kind of forgot about that, but obviously returned a punt with 8 guys on the field against Pitt. It was a pretty dangerous returner aside from that, he kept doing it year after year for a couple of years there. But Joey Galloway, I got to put him somewhere. He was a dangerous returner in the 90s, and that's what I've got.
Yeah, I had Joey Galloway as my kick returner. I actually had Joey Galloway as my punt returner too, but I think you've talked me into David Boston. He is still the punt return career yardage leader. 98 returns, 959 yards. He's a I think he's a really, really good, underappreciated. That was a big and underappreciated part of his game. It's also one of those things where, that's a lot of punt returns for a guy who's also your number one receiver. I don't think that's a guy who would be returning punts for multiple years now with the game being the way it is. He finished with 2 career touchdowns on punt returns. I don't remember the second one. Do you remember the second one for him?
No, I don't.
The first one is obviously the Pitt 1996 one at the end of the 72-0 game where they had 8 guys on the field, like you mentioned, but I don't remember the second one. But he's someone who, he was so dominant as a receiver that I think the punt return piece of his game kind of gets a little bit overlooked. And Galloway, I think Galloway is one of those guys who might be on this team if he was playing with better quarterbacks during the time he was there. You put Joey Galloway on that 1995 team. He was another top. He went to the Seahawks as I think a top 10 pick in that 95 draft. Yeah, number 8. So in that 95 draft, you put him on that 95 Ohio State team across from Terry Glenn. Like, what does that look like? Good luck defending that. But instead, he was on that 94 team with the sophomore Bobby Hoying, or I guess was second year starting Bobby Hoying. And that 93 team where they kind of yo-yoed back and forth between Brett Powers and Bobby Hoying. And Galloway missed time. He had something where he sat out that 94 season opener against Fresno State with, something that wouldn't even be remotely illegal today, but was an extremely big deal then, like, taking $17 from an agent or something stupid like that. So, he's someone who you put him, much like you'd love to see Ted Ginn on a Ryan Day passing offense. Ted Ginn and Santonio Holmes, put those guys on a Ryan Day offense. I'd love to see Joey Galloway on a Ryan Day offense. Yeah,
he's usually my number one pick in terms of who would you like to see in the modern day. I will say Kenyon Rambo led them, and he's the second all-time leading kickoff return yardage guy, and yet 4 other guys in the 90s returned kickoffs for touchdowns for Ohio State. Can you name them as we're trying to wrap up the show?
Oh boy, kickoff returns for touchdowns in the 1990s. Well, I know Sean Springs did it in the Boston College game in 1996, or 95. That's the first Ohio State game I ever saw in person in the Meadowlands in New Jersey. Let's see, other kickoff returns in the 90s. Oh boy, it has been a minute since I've had to think about a lot of these plays. Boy, Jonathan Wells almost did it against Michigan in 1999, and then they got 0 points out of the drive. How'd that season go? Well, there, I just told you. Did Robert Smith do it at some point? No. All right. Did Terry Glenn do it at some point?
No, not according to the OSU records books, by the way, when you ask me these questions.
What do they know? You're going to have to, you're just going to have to, I have no specific memory of any kickoff return for a touchdown in the 1990s other than the Sean Springs one against Boston College. So help me out.
Michael Wiley in 97 had one against Bowling Green. Joey Galloway in 1994 at Indiana. Butler Benote, 1993 at Pitt.
Yeah. So, I think my big takeaway from there was Ohio State did not have any kickoff returns in any games that were in doubt beyond about the second quarter is probably my big takeaway there.
All right, so there you go. Our team of the 90s. I think it's a pretty good squad. If you want to share your own thoughts, feel free to hit us up. Find us on Twitter. Find us at Buckeye Huddle. Yell at us on the message board. Leave a comment. Leave a 5-star rating or review on this podcast, and then go ahead and click the like on this video if you're watching it on YouTube. So that will do it for us. I want to thank you all for joining us, and we'll talk to you guys later.